Welcome to the Neophytes of Narratology, the internet's most pretentious and pseudo-intellectual pursuit since, perhaps, Nietzsche's thus podcast Zarathustra, or Camus' renowned Vlog of Sisyphus. While lesser men aspire to stand on the shoulders of mere giants, we at the Lost Signals will accept nothing less than titans. So join us as we delve into the fundamentals of narrative nuance and critique the critics who proclaim to know the universal qualities of effective storytelling. Hello and welcome to another episode of Neophytes of Narratology. I'm Jonathan Ian Manser, here with Stephen Ramose.
Hello.
And Scott Thurlow.
Welcome.
Today first I want to give a shout out to our, I wouldn't want to say fellow narratologist, because he is far more knowledgeable than we are. But
he's not a neophyte,
no,
at least.
not. Keith Bowman, who has contacted us about our podcast. He is a doctoral candidate in narrative studies, and it's very, he offered us a good discussion and some good writings to read for our podcast.
And therefore, we're taking his advice. We can call him a newly found friend of the show, if you will.
Yes. Yeah. So this is the second episode of a fan request of sorts.
Fan suggestion.
Yeah. Where we are doing The Writer's Audience is Always Fiction by Walter J. Ong.
Mm-hmm.
So I will give a very, very brief kind of context of this work. In 1972, he gave a speech on this in Cambridge University. He's a Jesuit priest and a philosopher, and who's very interested in narrative. And this work is on how, in oration, there is a direct connection between the speaker and the audience. But it has not really been explored before this work, how, or at least Ong claims, on how the writer connects with his audience
and the differences
and
between
the role
those.
of the audience in that. And he goes into depth not only about fiction but other types of writing, and basically this is the whole framework. So we'll go into the first section now. It begins with the discussion on the lack of study in the writer and the audience, but goes into also the history of how the audience's role in rhetoric. So, Scott, you have a point?
Just to quickly, it's funny because the last Neophytes, or recently for Halloween, we did an article, essay by Uncle Siggy, as you might, as we've been calling him. Sigmund Freud, as I like to also mispronounce Bill and Ted style. However, the opening of this sort of reminded me of that, where I do agree it's a valid point, but it's like not many other people have explored this, so I will explore it for you.
Yeah.
I just had a little note there when I was going through it, but that's all I wanted to mention.
But it's far less pretentious than Freud was about.
I mean, I agree. Like, yes, it's a very underexplored little avenue. Sure.
Well, he's got a different fictional audience.
Sure. Well said.
I'm pretty sure Freud's audience was himself. But we'll go into that.
Or not. But anyways, about this paper.
His own ego.
So basically the first section asks the question, who is the writer's audience? And the rest of it goes on to kind of discuss that. And he brings up how, in a way, versus rhetoric, which you're directly speaking, as a speaker, you're directly engaging an audience, and the audience has certain clues, customs when it comes to being...
And immediate ones, I think, is a big difference there. Yeah, sure.
Where, in a sense, all of a writer's audience is fiction. And he goes, again, we'll explore that kind of idea,
or at least in
depth in later sections.
They're fictionalized as he uses throughout, sure.
Well, what's interesting is kind of the dynamic, or the conversational dynamic of, because the writer is writing to people he doesn't know, and the audience is engaging with someone who is, it's not as you mentioned, immediate. So there's a if you again read a author from the 1600s, you are quite disengaged from their
original intended audience, essentially. Yeah,
exactly. So he brings up a lot of really good, what distinguishes the rhetoric from the writerly.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, I picked out a nice little line, I think, that sort of encapsulate that, where he writes, "Context for the spoken word is simply present, centered in the person speaking, and the one or ones to whom he addresses himself, to whom he's related existentially in terms of the subcambient actuality." Which basically a fancy way of saying, yeah, it's a lot sort of, I don't want to use the term easier, but again, it's sort of more visceral, perhaps, oration, that is, because you're engaged, literally face to face,
Right. Well,
with a person or the audience, and so like the dynamics about it are just different.
yeah, and as he talks about later, you can, as an orator, you can base your storytelling off of audience reaction.
Yeah,
Whereas a
and
writer,
feedback,
you have to be removed from basically everyone in order to write what you want to write. I think I just wanted to mention one of the parts that he talks about in this first section briefly is he's talking about a student writing how I spent my summer vacation.
Yeah, I kind of like that. It was a nice little anecdotal little.
So it was a good example of the student. If the student actually goes into that thinking, how am I going to write this? The student needs to know who the audience that he or she is talking to is, and you say, am I writing this for a grandparent? Am I writing this for other students? Am I writing this for my teacher? And based on any one of those, given any given one of those, you're going to write in a completely different way.
Sure.
And I think what he says is what very often happens is a student will just pick up a way of writing from someone they've read before. I think Mark Twain was the example in this one.
It was.
And use that
sort of co-opt that as their
that to write the paper, which will work to good effect, especially if you have a teacher who likes reading Mark Twain. You
mentioned that, like, it's sort of like if you're this hypothetical student and you're writing this ostensibly for, say, literary class, English class, then you will imagine, like, either you were assigned Mark Twain already,
right?
So you must assume that your teacher has read Mark Twain. So you think to yourself, oh, if I tell the story as Mark Twain would tell it, then that will be helpful and make me perhaps get a good grade or etc. make a good story.
Yeah.
I actually have a quote to follow that up. If the writer succeeds in writing, it is generally because he can fictionalize in his imagination an audience he has learned to know not from daily life, but from earlier writers who were fictionalizing in their imagination audiences. They had learned to know in still earlier writers, and so back to the dawn of written narrative. And that's kind of that idea of, like, if I'm taking from Samuel Clemens, he took from someone else, he took from someone else.
Yeah, sure.
Going back to the Greek Homer
to the original of it. And I thought that was a well-made point, too. And I want to point out one nice little, like, again, it's not snarky, but I sort of liked it. It's where, just before that right before he goes into that little section, Steve-O, Ong writes, "But I'm speaking, or writing here, rather, of the audience." Like, I thought that was a nice little sort of a little, clever little touch there.
Now, we all attempted to be writers at
we
one
like to
point.
fancy ourselves authors, sure.
Who did you think your audience was when you were writing?
Now, see, I thought you would bring this question later on, but I'll certainly answer it because it was one I definitely thought about while reading this essay. Like, it's funny, me, sort of, you're right, fictionalized versions of me. Like, here's what I thought to myself. My style of writing, I like to throw in a lot of references or, like, sort of plays on things that I recognize. So I'll give you, if I may, quick little tangent anecdote. I like the old little phrase that used to supposedly, and I believe is probably true somewhere, put on maps, right? But they didn't know uncharted territory when they're first exploring the world in the age of exploration. It would say something like, "Here be monsters,"
Here
or "Here be dragons," or whatever, right? So in one of my stories, I abstracted it. I said, "Here be hope," or something like that. And so I was like, if you had known, if you're aware of the original source, then you can take that line, sort of add an extra layer onto it. And if you're not, it still ostensibly says what it says. You get something more out of it. So to answer the question, sort of like the people who I would like to hang out with, like you guys would get that reference, people in our circle. So my fictionalized audience was some, like, sort of mirror image versions of myself and others who I know.
It is funny, he does talk about something similar to that later when he talks about what the audience, what you can expect the audience to know.
Yes.
Where, I forget what section it is, but in a later section he says, yeah, listen, you wouldn't say Shakespeare, a great writer.
A well-known Elizabethan playwright.
A well-known Elizabethan playwright.
You should know that. Yeah.
You wouldn't say that to anybody. certainly not in something about writing, but even in something about what do you say, like diving or something like that.
Yeah.
Like oceanography or something like that.
Yeah,
he was like,
marine
it doesn't
biology.
matter. Anybody that you talk to is going to know who Shakespeare is.
One would assume.
You can just assume that they know what that is.
But my question.
So, who is my fictional audience? I don't know. I kind of always thought of myself as writing to myself and a group of like-minded other people. So, like you guys. I always thought of myself as writing
sort of like what
for
I just
you
said,
guys.
kind of, yeah.
Somebody that would recognize the conventions of writing like the people that I was reading at the time, like Neil Gaiman or
etc.
or Alan Moore or something.
Yeah. Like you just said,
I feel you fell more into what his description.
like the
writing.
influences that have come before, and sort of, if not co-op, but like enfold their, what you experience reading those authors into your own writings.
Well, I will say this though, I picked up writing again recently, and I'm not doing as much of it as I should, but I am trying to get something
instead,
out. And I'm rethinking kind of how I'm writing and who I'm writing for while I'm doing. And it was something that I was thinking about even before I read this article, which this came at a good time, and I actually used a couple things from this and stopped reading for a couple minutes and started going into how I was going to work some of this into the newest thing that I'm working on.
Sure, cool.
See, I guess I'm a selfish prick.
That's definitely true.
Because
sure, but why?
I would just when I used to write, and even when we were podcasting, which I'll get to in a second. But when I was writing, I would just read it back to myself and listen to the flow of it and flatter myself with the poetry of it.
That's certainly part of it.
But that was it. There was no idea of
right.
Will anyone get this? And I know it's a flaw because sometimes something will make sense to me where it doesn't make sense to others. But I never viewed
it wasn't a consideration for you.
Very much like this podcast in a way. I'm doing this I find a lot of it. I thought of it immediately upon reading this, that the podcast is a lot like, it's a weird kind of mixture of
both,
traditional kind of rhetoric and oratory skills, and also being the writer, because we're isolated from anyone listening. Mm-hmm. If there is anyone listening. So,
hello, are you out there?
Can anybody hear me?
What's odd is that where writing is a solitary action, for the most part.
And he mentioned that as well. Yeah.
Here, I'm having, my audience is you two.
Mm-hmm. And
your audience is ostensibly me, if I'm actually listening to what you guys are saying.
What was that? Go on.
But it's such a weird thing of comment sections are basically the only interaction and occasional email we have with the audiences. So it's a kind of, if I've gathered nothing else from this work, it's having audiences are weird.
Sure, no man, I get it. It
is weird, but I do enjoy a back and forth. So write to us, please. We're very lonely people.
Speak for yourself. You can write to us or not, whatever. But I mean, as facetious as that may be, right? The point stands. It's odd, and he I think section 2 sort of explores it more in depth. That writing is again later skill, if you will, beyond the original Greek oratory and debates and so forth, and the old philosophy schools in that sense. So you're right. You don't have an immediate engagement with anyone really, maybe not even yourself, but still there's something there that requires just a bit of handling it differently, and that of course then as he mentions, he sort of goes on to describe sort of a brief history the printing press, etc. So now it's more accessible, the globalization of accessible works, what would have been oratory stories now can be written down and passed out and dispersed throughout, experienced by people, by audiences who were not originally perhaps intended for.
So that's a good transition to the second section, unless anyone has any further thoughts.
No, absolutely.
All right, so this one is kind of going over how to fictionalize an audience, or at least in this one, he gives out 2 rules for things to consider with it. I'm going to read the quotes for that. First, that the writer must construct in his imagination, clearly or vaguely, an audience cast in some sort of role. And he goes on to give a couple of versions of that. But then second, we mean that the audience must correspondingly fictionalize itself. A reader has to play the role in which the author has cast him,
Yes,
which
I like
seldom
that quote quite a bit.
coincides
Sorry, yeah.
with his role in the rest of actual life, which is a little Bartesian.
A little
In
bit.
a way. And he actually references Roland Barthes.
He does reference Barthes, and I did the exact same thing doing my notes, doing my reading. But yes, go on.
And then he's going into the process that he begins with the history. The third section will delve far more into history, but he kind of brings up how like those who are transcribing Homeric epics would have visualized themselves as providing to the same audience that the orators would have.
Were, sure.
Yeah. And I honestly, I think that the most stark contrast that you find in the second section is right at the end, right before the last paragraph, where he says how these texts and other, and it goes into the last paragraph as well, but how these texts and other oral performances were in fact originally set down in writing remains puzzling, but the transcribers certainly were not composing in writing, rather recording with minimal alteration what a singer was singing or was imagined to be singing. Even so, a scribe had to fictionalize in a way a singer did not, for a real audience was not really present before the scribe. And I just thought that was an interesting thing. So you can take this oral performance and
transcribe it essentially, or sure.
And yeah, exactly. And it become like your audience becomes fictional at that point. So the scribe is the scribe and whoever else is listening or whatever is the audience at first. You don't have to fictionalize them in any way, but as soon as that scribe takes it and tries to bring that to everyone else becomes the fiction to them, you know?
Sure, yeah, no, that's a good point. And like I said, it sort of goes back briefly, like, yeah, that's sort of like the origin, perhaps at least one of the origin points of, let's say, writing capital W in general. But yeah, in terms of that, they would basically be giving to you, spitting back to you what the actual, like the chorus lines were in the Greek plays and so forth. So sure, it was as if you were in the audience, like that's how it would be sung to you, as he mentions, but you're not actually there listening to it.
You can't hear the song.
Yeah.
All right. So, is there any other? Section 2 is pretty short.
No, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that section.
Yeah.
It was good though. It was quality.
All right. So the third section starts to go into
Style, maybe, kind of.
A kind of historical way of looking at how narrative developed, but it also goes into some linguistical territory, which I'll cover.
Which I wrote, in fact, real quickly, as a humorous note, when that section comes up, or when that a passage of this section, I wrote Ian territory in my notes, because I knew you would love to cover it, and it's all about, all about that.
I'm going to start with Hemingway.
Yes, can't wait.
So,
because I like this section a lot.
I'm kind of going off track of how he writes this, but it kind of gives a kind of a brief history of how writing developed to what I'm going to call intimate fictionalization, which he credits Hemingway with having pioneered.
If not invented, then popularized.
Yeah,
right.
Codified in a way. So it starts off with the traditional like Aeneid and Homeric epics, and then he talks about a lot of interesting ways that writers attempted to bridge into the novel, or the current novel. So he talks about, of course, Don Quixote, which is credited as the first modern novel. He talks about the use of framework devices, such from Chaucer's Tales, or using letters and journals, like
Lovecraft style.
And Bram Stoker's Dracula was very famous for doing that as well. True. But because of Hemingway's history in journalism, he developed a new, or
I would say he unfolded those instincts, if you will, into his actual prose.
Which made the fictionalized audience feel like a compatriot, a friend, a person who was there having a shared experience with the author.
Exactly. And I picked out a little passage I think that I quite liked and sort of encapsulates that. Ong says, or Ong writes, the writer, speaking about Hemingway, The writer needs only to point, for what he wants to tell you about is not the scene at all, but his feelings. These, too, he treats as something you really had somehow shared, though you might not have been quite aware of it at the time. So I was like, that's a really sick point. Like, I didn't really think about that, even having read Hemingway, been a big fan.
Yeah.
But you're right, like, that is the effect it creates. And Ong also starts this section with a passage from Hemingway.
Right.
And sort of, as you said, sort of barts it a little bit, like, sort of breaks down a close reading, if you will, of this little section, and as to why and how it works and is effective at that.
He talks a lot about... He actually talks a lot about Hemingway in this section, as we've been over, but he talks a lot about how the terms "this" and "the"
I knew that's
bring you in, and I'm gonna. All right, so I'll leave most of that to you.
You can go. That was the next section I was going to discuss.
But how these terms really make you feel like you're, standing there on this shore or the shore of the river,
or the plain, or whatever.
Right.
Sure.
Wherever he is, and that's what he took out of the little passage that he gives from Hemingway there. But he says the late summer of that year, and you don't know what summer of what year it was.
But it doesn't matter.
But it doesn't matter. It doesn't make any difference. The thing is that you feel like, hey, I'm in that late summer of the year with the narrator, and I'm there.
Yeah,
and that was Hemingway's kind of contribution to. He says, Hemingway's style is often characterized as straightforward, unadorned, terse, lacking qualifiers, close-lipped, and it is all of those things. But none of them were peculiar to Hemingway. When his writing began to command attention, a feature more distinctive is the way he fictionalizes the reader, and this fictionalizing is often signaled largely by his use of the definite article as a special kind of qualifier, or of the demonstrative pronoun that, of which the definite article is simply an attenuation. So, I thought that was the most important and interesting part of this passage.
I don't know if it's most important, but we don't split hairs. But yes, that's Ian's linguistical study kind of stuff, which you will certainly speak about. But what I liked, and it's sort of that is unfolded into the fact that. For me, the most interesting thing about this was that then makes you, he points out that when you read Hemingway, and specifically that passage in general, it makes you feel as if you are comrade in arms to him. Mm-hmm. So like I said, he's not, it doesn't matter what year it is or what mountains or river it is. And what matters is that you feel as if you're being intimate with this narrator, and he's about to share his feelings that are hitherto seen, have been unrevealed to you.
Hitherto seen?
Yeah, I'm making up words linguistically on the spot. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know.
That's the most important part. It's revealed to you that, and not the description of the scene itself. Gutty.
So I'm not going to actually discuss demonstratives, lest this be a 5-hour long.
Turn it into a lecture, would you?
But there are two sections I want to talk about, or at least kind of tangents off of this. Mm-hmm. One, I was reading a fascinating article about how, in a sense, there's kind of a movement in politics, but also in public speaking today, with the idea of it off the cuff works feeling like giving the impression of being more social and more welcoming than necessarily scripted works. And I think that is what we do. We don't obviously don't script anything on this show, unless we just do terrible script reading.
It sounds robotic, of course.
Yes. But also, I wanted to bring up just a pet peeve. I don't have enough of information on hand to really counter him on this, but I'm quite sure Voltaire did a lot of, or pioneered a lot of these tactics,
similar techniques
that he credits to Hemingway. I love Hemingway, don't get me wrong, but I did a massive paper once upon a time on Voltaire, and he did a lot of these using trying to draw the audience as if a friend is telling them a story. In a sense, how Conrad would do that with Marlowe and oh, you're sitting on a boat, let me tell you this story. That kind of framework.
And I think he mentions Marlowe or Conrad Marlowe as the narrator in Heart of Darkness as well. But I mean, you're right about that, and I agree. And I thought it was quite interesting. And the thing that I like to point out is that he, as you just mentioned, that Hemingway has its roots in journalism, and so not that style is completely new per se. But if you can use it correctly, so therefore, he mentions Thomas Gibson, I believe. He cites as writing a book. Mm-hmm. that he references elsewhere, but wrong. Right. So Gibson has shown how much the style of Time magazine is an adaptation of Hemingway's style. So, but Time adds omniscience, solemnly, in quotes, reporting, for example, an eyewitness style, behavior and feelings, etc. Hemingway encourages readers in high self-esteem. Time provides its readers on a regular weekly basis companionship with all-knowing gods. And I thought that was quite well said. Reader, that's their sort of intent, and the way they do it does kind of make you feel like that in terms of, reporting and news and so forth. So I just thought it was a quite well done little section there.
Yeah.
I just realized that in my description of the third section, I enfolded the fourth section, which dealt with. So in the previous section, he talked about Hemingway pioneering the intimate fictionalization. In the fourth section, he's doing what I'm calling the directed fictionalization, which he begins by describing how in Greek plays they would call upon the muse, and or in fairy tales you do once upon a time.
The meeps, right? Or the moops. Yes, go on.
And kind of signaling the start of the audience participation in this fictional
It's basically suspension of disbelief time, sort of, more or less.
Yeah.
But when you go to see movies in the movie theater, it generally has that kind of similar feel of the lights going down. Or even if you go to a stage play, they're setting the tone for you to suspend your reality.
Yeah. Right? I mean, that's a mechanic that has been passed down, started there, and of course has never quite gone away. I think you're right about that.
Yeah. But again, as I mentioned earlier, he goes on the frameworks, the letters in the journals style, the episodic style, which again, a lot of the episodic novels I've read were also based on the fact that they were writing the novels for newspapers.
Yes, well, like I said, it's sort of enfolded as to, he mentions, a journalistic tradition at the time, or emerging at that time.
I've read some other serialized works that just used serialization as a device. Anything more recently... I mean, I guess that you probably still get stories that come out over the course of months in a magazine or whatever.
Well, let me give you guys an example. Dickens was that was sort of his thing.
Right. But, The Green Mile was a serialized novel.
Yep.
Actually, Warren Ellis just wrote one recently.
Normal.
Called Normal. Yep. That was serialized at first and then collected all together in a book in the same way that Green Mile was. And I think writers throughout time have kind of done this as a way of changing their relationship with the audience. Making...
Or at least the dynamic of that relationship.
Perhaps to some extent, like you say, trying to make the dynamic with that audience be similar to that of reading a magazine, reading Time or whatever.
I think I'm going to make a metaphor that will work to clarify my position on this. In a lot of ways, we live in a golden age of television where you have Netflix producing great series, HBO's producing great series, and the model for how television shows from being isolated, back in the
formulaic.
Day, not just formulaic, but the idea is that you didn't have to watch all of them in order. You could pick out any episode of
and read much the same
in the 90s sitcom, and it'd be the same thing. There wouldn't be overarching narratives or season-long narratives.
Right.
Nowadays, though, almost all major shows are, in a sense, required viewing from week to week.
Sure, you can't just jump in an episode.
At least dramas. Sitcoms aren't necessarily the same, although to some extent they are. Yeah. Certainly more than they were in the 80s and 90s.
Exactly. I think that's the point he was getting at, and I certainly agree with that, and I think it's easily seen.
Yeah, and I think that, yes, it's both a function of society and what people want to see, because in a lot of ways, television produces better quality works than movies can nowadays. But it's the fiction, the serial literature would transition depending on the time frame, depending on
for sure.
So I don't know. I think there's an interesting parallel there. If you want to you could really delve into that if you so chose.
Sure, well, we certainly could, but I don't think we should now. But you're right. There's a lot to be sort of mined there and explored. But Ang mentions it, and sort of like a brief history. I believe he mentions something like, this isn't quite his words, I'll try to paraphrase, sort of a genealogy of fictionalizing your audience. right? It starts here, like the building blocks of it, right?
Mhm.
Sort of like a basic template, and then it got more complex and sort of, nuanced as it went on.
As far as writing went, but I
Yes.
think that
He's saying,
that there was always this idea of like oral tradition had a long and storied past,
right.
and then writing became the new way to tell stories, and so they're developing that
Yes,
throughout. And
exactly.
I think that this article points that out fairly well.
I have another tangent.
All right.
I want your guys' opinions on, if you could.
Okay.
Big data.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that we can find out who our audience is in the sense of like very generalizations.
More so than
about it.
any other previous generation.
Yes.
Right.
And TV shows do that now. Books, I'm sure, have a way of tracking like pre-orders and things like that.
Yeah.
So is the fictionalization of an audience
Less or more? Is that kind of
or
the question?
now, like, would a writer
Necessarily
be
have to?
informed about who his or her audience is and can thus more likely to tailor their work for it?
I see the question you're saying. It's difficult to answer. I mean, without basically studying a whole course upon it. But I would say if I had to like sort of gut feeling it and based on my knowledge I do know, it might be almost moot in the end. Because think of it this way, right? Yes, you have ostensibly, in theory, more access to your actual audiences and who they are and what their tastes are. But you have to then have a way to process all that information. But you're still writing for like sort of a general, it's like, it's almost a demographic thing. Oh, I'm writing, it's a TV thing. 18 to 35-year-olds, of course, we always want to capture. But though, like within that, who are interested in X, Y, and Z thing. So I know that they're interested. Oh, I'm into sports. Oh, video games. Oh, whatever. Whatever it may be. So yeah, in theory, big data allows you to have access to that kind of stuff. But is it going to be all that useful to you to like try to sort of finagle it all together and then spit back out like something that's so tailored to that? Or if you're writing for that sort of general audience anyway, is that information even helpful to you? I guess that would be my question back to you.
I think more likely that's information that the publisher or the producers,
Marketing
whatever,
people might want,
are
but maybe not
looking
authors.
at more so than the writers. The writers are kind of being sold to those publishers or producers based on the audiences that are going to like them. I'm sure to some extent it helps some writers, but I don't think I don't think a large percentage of people are going out there writing specifically for a specific audience. I think they're writing what they like to write, and then they try to get picked up by who is most likely to buy that work.
Fair enough. I didn't have an answer. I just had a question.
No, I mean,
thought
it's definitely an
burning
interesting
into
question, and perhaps, again, we can probably make a whole episode of it, but just sort of a broad answer. Again, maybe it's helpful, but I think I would be closely inclined to agree with Steve-O there that you're going to do it anyways, and that's probably the audience you're writing for, like, regardless, no matter how specialized you may be able to extract information or data or their taste, if you will, from it nowadays.
Okay, well, we're on to the fifth section, which I don't have much to say about, actually. It's more of him applying his theory to other types of writing beyond fiction, which is letter writing, diary writing. Who's your audience there?
Well, sort of like, before that, though, I just want to point out that he touches upon historians.
Yes, that's it.
Right?
Yeah.
So, like, he starts with that, and, like, I think it's interesting if, like, maybe not 100% relate. Like, it's more of a tangent so far in the paper. Not that I didn't enjoy it, but it's an interesting point, but I think it sort of almost requires its own paper unto itself upon that topic. Mm-hmm. But basically his point is, historians, both oral, like previous ages, and now like written, histories and so forth of later cultures and societies, that you're still writing ostensibly for an audience that's
Right.
probably fictionalized. It's just that like that isn't really explored because history, in quotes, is ostensibly taken as rote fact. But nevertheless, somebody is writing it down and choosing which events to write about and how to interpret them and what they thought was important about each one.
I think that what he says is that oral historians have themes and formulas that are provided by tradition, whereas writers rely less on traditional formulas than oral historians do, but they have more. They're more heavily laden with themes.
Yes.
Because they can go and because there's millions of themes to pick from a historical
Perspective,
standpoint.
sure.
Couldn't it be argued then that the narrative that the historian was to go with is more important than, in fact, the historical story he wishes to tell?
Well, I think that's what he's saying.
yeah.
There's a point where he says
Definitely digs upon that, sure.
there's no one thing to say about anything. It's whatever your narrative is.
Agenda, if you will, like to use...
A, your narrative, and B, whatever, audience you're writing to, and what they want to hear, or what really, whatever fictional audience you're writing to, what they want to hear is really is really the history that you're going to project upon people. Going into the diaries and
letters.
I want
to speak about letters. How about you speak about diaries and I want to talk about letters?
All right, go ahead. Talk about letters.
All right, so quickly, as you point out, it's two sort of outline, not like weird specialized cases.
Well, this is what the entire chapter is about.
Right. But specific to written works, where I'll just read off the passage I thought was interesting about. The case of the letter is really simple enough. Although by writing a letter, you are somehow pretending the reader is present while you are writing, you cannot address him as you do an oral speech. You must fictionalize him, make him to a special construct. Whoever saluted a friend on the street with "Dear John," and if you try to the informal horrors, "Hi," or "Greetings," or whatever else, the effect is not less, but more artificial. Right? You're reminding him that you wish you were not writing him a letter, but then, why are you? There is no other way out. There is no way out. So it's just a specific relationship, like a weird sort of parsing out when you're writing a letter to someone and the way to phrase it and so forth.
Yeah. And when he goes into diaries, he's talking about how strange, perhaps the most fictional audience is yourself.
Right. I knew you were going to say that, and I like that too.
Because how strange it is to be telling yourself all these things. Which self are you writing to? One that you wish you were? One from 20 years from now, your present self? Who are you actually writing this for? Whose benefit are you doing it for? And perhaps that's the hardest to figure out, because you don't have long conversations with yourself all that often, except for perhaps in a diary.
I do.
When you go and say, or you go and say, parse things out into paragraphs and perhaps make more clear than the things that swirl around in your head, or try to make more clear than the things that swirl around in your head, exactly what your state of mind is. You have to figure out which one of yourselves that you're writing for, which one of your masks that you're writing for. And he goes into people having all these masks they wear throughout their lives, and certainly you have to write for one or several of those, and not like you can't specifically get down to your own true self, because that's impossible, except for, I think, perhaps the quote that you're going to say.
Perhaps nobody
Scott.
can.
So, would you say that Billy Joel's The Stranger inspired this work around diaries, or
no,
this was what inspired Billy Joel's?
I think they're unrelated. They're just sort of coincidental that it happened. I mean, it's a funny question, but no, I mean, you're right, Steve. And again, unlike himself, the case of the diary, which at first glance should seem to fictionalize the reader least, but in many ways probably fictionalizes him the most,
right,
brings into full view the fundamental deep paradox of the activity we call writing, at least when writing moves from its initial account-keeping purposes to other more elaborate concerns, more directly and more complexly involving human persons in their manifold dealings with themselves and one another. For sure. And you're right, the mass thing. So this, starting from that and like the rest of the section, really, my notes just say increasingly strange tangent, but interesting, more or less.
Yeah.
And he brings up the massing, like psychology, of phenomenology, so forth, all that. But you're right, like, sure, it's odd when you think about it, like, oh, I'm just writing, I'm keeping diary, but you're talking to yourself in a bizarre way.
Right.
That, like, I talk to myself all the time, but of course, in my own head, everyone does. I'm not writing every fucking thing that I think to myself down of every second.
You get the feeling, you get the idea of what you're trying to think of, and then you're like, oh, I got the rest of that. Yeah. You don't really actually, often put it down into words and say, hey, me, this is exactly what I was thinking.
Oh, my walls are covered with scribblings of my immediate thoughts.
Ian lives in a room full of crazy, of course. But and I want to read the last section too, just to sort of like bookend what I just wrote. So let me try to try to paraphrase it a bit, because it's kind of long, but I want to pick out the ones that I want. So he's talking about love. Like, he brings that in. There must be a movement in all communication, insofar as related to actual experience. There must be a movement of love. Those who have loved over many years may reach a point where almost all masks are gone, but never all. The lover's plight is tied to the fact that every one of us puts on a mask to address himself as well. Such masks to relate ourselves to ourselves, we must also try to put aside, and with wisdom and grace we to some extent succeed in casting them off. When the last mask comes off, sainthood is achieved, and the vision of God, I guess. But the last line says, but this can only be with death. I just wrote awesome. Like, I get what he's getting at. It's very kind of flowery said, but it's sort of like neither here nor there, but cool that he included it.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's sort of the tail end of this section.
Yes, so we're done with this. Any final thoughts?
No, I mean, like, my final thought is I quite enjoyed this essay. Thank you, Keith, for recommending it to us.
Yeah.
It was excellent. And it's something I both did and didn't think about, especially as we were talking about earlier when we were actually in college trying to be writers, authors ourselves. That, like, yeah, it's this effect, I guess I want to call it, like, exists. And to the degree that you're aware of it, like whether or not you're even incorporating it into your writing, it nevertheless is there. And as much, if you think about it, and as he points out, delve deeply into it, it's a lot different than actually speaking to people. So yeah, you're right, E. Doing a podcast is sort of like maybe the most modern version of it, where we're both speaking, but not speaking to an audience, really, in a sense. At least not, again, in a 1-to-1 ratio, if you will, in real time. So no, I enjoyed it, and we'll probably read some more essays that you suggest to us, but I'll just say I like the title. The writer's audience is always a fiction. It's very, says what it says. But no, it's quite well done, and brought up some points. We missed a little thing, but he brings up also on, in addition to pointing out Hemingway as an example, he brings up a little, I think it's even a footnote, in fact, not even in the actual paper itself, but a little thing about T.S. Eliot and how he had sort of had a theory about the voices of yourself as the writer and the audience you're writing to, and sort of the intersection between them, which I thought was quite interesting. And yeah, again, it was all very well done. I quite enjoyed it, and I probably will definitely keep it in mind going forward, almost like our first fan suggestion, Noel Carroll's narrative closure. I will keep all of this in mind as I write and also read other writings myself.
Absolutely. I mean, you've said well more than I'm going to say about it there.
I took the words out of your mouth, if you will?
But I appreciate
to make a pun on this essay.
The chance to read this. I have heard of Ong before, but I had never read anything by him
really?
before this.
I have not.
You hadn't?
Nope. Never encountered him until now. Well, but I'm glad that I did.
I think he's a fairly well-known guy.
He will be now after a podcast,
anyway,
obviously.
I've definitely heard of him before, but I had not read anything by him, so this was nice, and I really liked, I really enjoyed the essay. That's pretty much it. I said pretty much what I'm going to say about it.
I was not particularly impressed, no offense, Keith. Noel Carroll definitely left much more of a narrative, like, an impression on me when I view narrative. Like, there was interesting things in this, but I don't know, overall, I don't necessarily fully disagree with him. It's just, I don't know if I pulled anything insightful out of this. And that's going to be my final judgment. I would
say, must that be the final measurement? I guess you're calling it as
I don't know. I didn't know if there was, you guys seem to have found it more profound than I did. So if anyone asked which of the work should I read off of this podcast, I would definitely say read Noel Carroll before this. I would say Freud before this, Aristotle before this.
I would not say Freud before this at all.
And I would definitely rank this above Barth, though, just on sheer volume that you have to. Susan Sontag read before this.
Yes.
But I don't know. That's just my opinion on it.
Certainly completely fair. Like I said, it's just something to keep in mind. At least I will. Like, I might call it almost equal to Noel Carroll's article, if maybe like a little below it, sure, but still something to think about and realize as you're reading other written works.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Nope. All right. Nope. I'm Jonathan E. Manzer. He was Stephen Ramosi.
Have a good night.
And Scott Thurlow.
And good night to our own fictionalized audience.
This has been the Neophytes of Narratology. We hope that you've experienced an epiphany or two of the literary nature, but only metaphorically, of course. Music by Christopher Morgan. Editing and engineering by Jonathan E. Manzer.